Let's see who's coming. It's Jeff. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Jeff, you're the only one here right now. Let's see who else is coming. All right, there's Riaz, Hassan, Nate. People are coming in. My son is having some trouble coming in. All right, how's everybody doing? Here we are in our session number 15. This is starting to get very interesting. I thought about maybe we should have actually included the following section because this actually finishes the section. So what I might do,
Poor guy was hungry.
somebody's mic is open.
Give him some more. Oh.
Okay, if whoever has their mic on, can you please shut it off? Okay, Hassan, okay. Right. Riaz, if you can shut your mic, please. Riaz, are you there? There we are. Okay, that's better. I thought because this actually, there's only one more subsection involved here. So what I might do this time, we might just finish the section as a whole. And then for the following week, because there's a longer subsection that follows in the following week. And then, so this week we'll have quite a bit of discussion. And then actually quite a bit of reading and probably a lot of discussion on top of it. And then the following week, we will start on the next part of this book. So number 9, principle concerning the psychic and intelligible man and the theory of forms, which he has really summarized because it's far more complex in the Asfar in the way that he unpacks all of this. But anyway, he summarized it relatively well. So let's read it. Section 9, principle concerning the psychic and intelligible man and the theory of forms. In the interior of this man, created from the elements in the natural body, there's a man of soul, intermediate between the physical and the purely noetic words, essentially alive. Now, before I go on, in the Sheikhi diction of what this means, Sheikh Ahmed al-Ahsaid goes a long way to create 4 different bodies, apply 4 different bodies to humans. So there is the somatic frame, which he calls the jasad, or the jasad A. Then there is a subtle form of the somatic frame, which is not exactly spiritual, but is not exactly physical either, and he calls that jasad B. Then there are 2 forms of the astral body. One he calls jism B, or jism is just another word for body in Arabic, but there's a difference sometimes between the words jasad and jism. So he uses jism A and jism B. Jism B is related to jasad B, right? And this is, for lack of a better word, it is the soul. And then beyond that is jism A, and jism A is the primordial body. And this primordial body is located depending on whether somebody actually activates it in this lifetime or not. Because once that jism A, that primordial body, is activated in a given person, they have basically accomplished the alchemical or the spiritual palingenesis of themselves. But once that is activated, that is located at the highest end of the world of Malakut, and then begins its own journey in the post-mortem state in the worlds beyond even the Malakut, so into the world of the Empyrean, etc., until it ends up by implication, he doesn't say this exactly, but it ends up in the place in the world of Lahut, in the world of the divinity, where in Ilo Tempore, the forms of the true believers of the Ahl Bayt, of the Imams, were first created. Like I mentioned in the last session, that there's these hadith that say that. So this is the way that the Sheikhis deal with it, but basically Mulla Sadra, in a kind of in his own way, is saying exactly the same thing. So a man who is thus in all of his organ, senses, and powers, this man exists this very instant. His life is not like the life of this body, which is accidental and occurs to it from the outside. Rather, he has life by his very essence. And this man of soul is a substance intermediary in being between the physical man and the man of pure intellect. Or intellect, we don't mean as in, ratiocination, we mean as in aql, as in the nexal consciousness. This is similar to the position taken by the master of philosophers, Aristotle, actually Plotinus, in his book Ma'rifat al-Rububiyyah, Knowledge of the Divine Lordship, the famous theology of Aristotle, which is actually Ennead's 6, and it's particularly its 5th and 6th sections. For he said, in this bodily man, there is the man of soul and the man of intellect or nexal consciousness. By this, I do not mean that this bodily man is those two, but rather he is connected with them, that he is an image of them. That is, that he performs some of the activities of the man of the intellect or nexal consciousness and some of the activities of the man of the soul. Now, the intellect occurs in the world of the Jabarut, as we said last week. It's the spiritual substance, pure, and that is associated in Mulla Sadra's cosmology with the intellect, with the Ak itself. This is because the characteristics of both of these, that is of soul and of intellect, are in the bodily man, except that they are in him only rarely in a weakened and diminutive way, since he is the image of an image. In another place in that book, he said that this bodily man is only an image of the first true man, right? Or the insan al-azali, as it's phrased in the Bayani texts, the pre-eternal man. Or in the Kabbalah, we have the concept of the Adam Kadmon, right? He also said that the powers and life and states of this bodily man are weak, while in the first man, they're exceedingly strong. The first man has strong, clear senses that are more powerful, clearer, and more manifest in the senses of this bodily man, because as we have said several times, those of the bodily man are only their images, right? And just remember what we read a couple of weeks ago, that the world of the senses, right, is actually occurring on another plane. So what we are sensating in this world has its origin, its real, true archetypal reality in another world, and that what we are experiencing right now in this world is an accident, right? These impressions are not real that we are sensing. Their reality is already always right now occurring on another plane, right? So then take that aboard to what he just said here. Know that the approach of this great man, meaning Aristotle, or rather Plotinus, includes the affirmation of an intelligible man, horse, and all the other species of plants and animals, of an intelligible earth, hell, true divine paradise, and the loftiest heavens, of all the other separate noetic divine forms and specific natures existing in God's knowledge in the world of his decree, the forms of manifestation of his names that endure with God through his enduring, since none of these forms or names has an independent being, but rather are all modes of the divine essence and the veils of the divine lordship, whereas Ibn Arabi emphasized from the very first chapter of the Bezels of Wisdom, they are nothing more than relations. In relation, of the Allah to the Ma'luh, God to the divine thrall, or that which is God, which is the universe. This was precisely the approach of his teachers, Plato and Socrates, concerning the forms. Not quite, but close enough. But the author of Ash-Shifa, the Book of the Healing, Avicenna's magnum opus, did not find it easy to comprehend this subject or to follow this path, so that he began to criticize this talk of the being of forms and to attack Plato and Socrates on this subject quite vehemently, which, I think Mulla Sadra, let me just turn on this air conditioner, which Mulla Sadra does exceedingly well, I think, in refuting Avicenna's problem with the whole notion of the Platonic forms. And obviously, Sohrawardi reappropriated that entire concept in his own cosmology, but then transforming the Platonic forms into an angelology, which is one of the most novel things done in the history of philosophy, in my opinion. Let's go on. Began to criticize this talk of the being of forms and attack Plato and Socrates on this subject quite vehemently. It is as though he had never looked at the theology, or as though he had attributed not to Aristotle, but rather to Plato. And in general, this question is one of the most obscure and difficult in all philosophy, one in which he who was granted wisdom has been given a great good. Indeed, no philosopher since the era of the ancient original ones has been able to arrive at a profound understanding of this topic and to correct it in view of the criticism and doubts directed against it, unless it be someone, that is Sadra himself, from this blessed community, praising God and giving thanks for his bounty and his grace. Number 10, principle concerning the soul as a spiritual body. This is the way that Mulla Sadra now recrafts this entire argument is as close as was ever done throughout the history of Islamic philosophy to Proclus's dealing with this subject. Sohrawardi has done it to some certain extent, but Proclus's notion of the uchima is a very profound contribution to Platonism itself. And although the relevant sections of his elements of theology don't appear to have been translated in Arabic, we have them now in the original Greek. But what Mulla Sadra does, it appears he either had access to a full translation of the elements of theology, or that he inferred and intuited the rest of Proclus's argument and then reframed his entire spiritual physiology based on this. So he says, individual mortal men in this world form a common species falling under a single definition of the species, composed of the proximate genus, that is animal, and the proximate specific differentia, rationality, terms taken respectively from the bodily matter and the form of the soul. You know, the formulation, the premise is man is rational animal. Here, Sadra is breaking it down. But the souls of human beings, after their initial coincidence as to species, will become different in their essences according to another mode of being and a second fundamental nature. There will become many different species falling under 4 main genera. This is because the soul, at the beginning of its generation with a particular body, is in actuality a form of perfection for sensible matter. But at the same time, the soul is spiritual matter with the capacity of receiving and being united with an intellective form, thereby emerging from potency into actuality, or a delusive satanic form, or that of a brutish or predatory animal. So hold on. This is a very important argument. The soul, the nafs, the pneuma, right, has 2 potentials. It can either unite with the spirit, which is the intellect, the ruh, right, or it cannot and fall down and become infernal. This is exceedingly fine argument that in his Asfar he does a beautiful job of explaining further. It is in these forms that they will be resurrected and rise up at the awakening or resurrection. That is, in another mode of being from this physical one, since that purely physical re-embodiment would mean that the transmigration of soul and not its resurrection. This is a subtle argument that where Mulla Sadra is now refuting the notion of reincarnation, primarily because every instantiation of a soul in Mulla Sadra is unique. So each spiritual matter that instantiates as a soul is a unique instantiation of that. So therefore, by this premise, reincarnation is nonsense. It's very different than what others, like for example, the Bayanis or some of the Batini sects talk about raja'a, the return. But those returns occur in archetypes, not in either the spiritual matter or in their in the physical matter, obvious, which is what some reincarnationists believe. But the transmigration of souls is impossible, which corporeal resurrection in the spiritual body is actually happening. In this world, therefore, man stands between becoming an angel, a devil, a brute, or a predatory beast. If knowledge and reverence predominated in him, he will become an angel. Or if he's given over to hypocrisy, cunning, and compounded ignorance, that is being unaware of his actual ignorance, then he will be a rebellious devil. If he surrenders to the effects of sensuous appetite, he will become a brute beast. And if overcome by the effects of irascibility and aggressiveness, then he will be a predatory animal. For the dog is a dog because of its animal form, not because of its particular matter. So a dog becomes a dog by virtue of the archetype of dogness, not by virtue of the matter, because what he's saying is that the physical matter is then commonly shared by all. And it's, in its principle, that matter is just matter. And whatever form that takes into it has a separate archetype. And the pig, too, is a pig because of its form, not its matter. Similarly, with all the other animals, some of them fall under the characteristic attributes of the appetitive soul according to its divisions, such as the mule, donkey, sheep, bear, mouse, cat, peacock, rooster, and so forth. Others fall under the characteristic attributes of the irascible soul, such as the lion, wolf, leopard, scorpion, eagle, falcon, and their like. Thus, according to the habits and states of character which predominate in a man's soul, so will he rise up in a corresponding form on the day of the rising. And thus man will become many species in the hereafter, as the divine book has expressed it, such as his saying, on the day when the enemies of God are raised up for the fire, they will be divided into groups, or on that day they will become separated into groups. One can also construe the verses in the Quran referring to the metamorphosis according to what we have said, such as the saying, may you be exalted, there is no creative walking the earth, and none flying with its wings, but that they are peoples like you, and others verses, such as his saying, on the day their tongues and hands and feet shall testify against them as to what they were doing. And his saying, O assembly of jinn, many are the men and jinn you have seduced. And his saying, when the wild beasts are raised up. The same reality is expressed in the saying of the Shaykh Imam Jafar as-Sadiq alayhi salam, men will be raised up according to the forms of their actions, or another version, according to the forms of their intentions. And yet another version, he states, some men will be resurrected according to a form which befits them, such as ticks or pigs. But just remember, this is all happening in another plane. It's not happening here in this spatio-temporal world of Nasut. This is how one may interpret the words of Plato, Pythagoras, and others among the ancients, whose language is that of symbolic figures and whose wisdom is taken from the Lamp-Nietzsche prophecy of the prophets, a common Islamic philosophical understanding that all of the Greek philosophers actually were inspired by prophets, corresponding prophets of their people. Now, as of what is mentioned in the books of official philosophy to the effect that one thing cannot be the form of something and the matter of for something else, this holds true only within a single state of being, that is physical reality, and for what has absolutely no connection with any corporeal matter, that is, the forms or separate intelligences. So the material world produces uniqueness, as does the purely spiritual world of the Jabarut, right? So true individuation occurs here, and it also occurs in the world of the pure spirit. But it is one of the properties of the soul in its state of connection with matter that it can take on and be united with one form after another. Moreover, the corporeal form, although in actuality a form for corporeal matter, is also potentially unintelligible. A very, very subtle and important argument. We have given in the Asvar, the four journeys, the proofs establishing the transubstantiation of all material natures. And the human soul is the quickest of all generated things so far as it changes and transformations in the physical and psychic and intellective modalities of being. In the initial stages of its fundamental generated nature, the soul is the conclusion of the world of sensible things and the beginning of the spiritual world. It is the greatest gateway to God through which one can be brought to the highest kingdom. But it also has a certain portion of all the gates of hell. It is the divider standing between this world and the other world, because it is the form of every potency in this world and the matter for every form in another world. Very, very important distinction he's making here. Thus, the soul is the junction of the two seas, Majma al-Bahrain, of corporeal and spiritual things. Its being the last of the corporeal realities is a sign of its being the first of the spiritual ones. If you consider its substance in this world, you will find it the principle of all the bodily powers, employing all the animal and vegetable forms in its service. But if you consider its substance in the world of the intellect, you will find that at the beginning of its fundamental nature, it is pure potential without any form in that world. But it has the capability of moving from potency to actuality with regard to the intellect and the intelligible. Its initial relation to the form of that world of the intellect, the pure spirit, is that of the seed to its fruit, or of the embryo to the animal, just as the embryo is in actuality an embryo and an animal only potentially. So at first, the soul in actuality, a mere mortal man, but potentially realized intellect. And then, like I mentioned earlier, Sheikh Ahmed As-Said takes this and develops this even beyond what Mulla Sadra is telling us here. Let me take a quick sip of this coffee. He concludes the section by saying, "It is to this that his saying that he be exalted alludes. Say, I'm a mere mortal like you. It is inspired in me that your God is one God. The semblance mentioned here between the soul of the prophet, God's blessing and peace be with him, and the souls of other mortal men refers to this initial state of being in the soul. But when, through divine inspiration, his soul moved from potentiality to actuality, he became the noblest of all creatures and nearer to God than any other prophet or angel, as indicated in his words, I have a time with God which I do not share with either a cherubic angel or any prophetic messenger." All right, that was section 9 and 10. And we have, let me see here, number 11. It goes on for a little bit. I will read this and then we will because this finishes a section. So rather than leave it for next week, I'll just finish the whole section this week. So number 11, principle 11, concerning the soul as the key to eschatology. This is where it gets really good. Know that souls which have emerged from potentiality to actuality with regard to the intellect and the intelligible are extremely few in number and rarely to be found among individual human beings. The vast majority of individual souls are imperfect, not having become intellect in actuality. But this does not entail the annihilation of these souls after death, as Alexander Aphrodisias, one of Aristotle's commentators, supposed, since his supposition was based on the supposition that there are only two worlds of being, the world of material bodies and the world of intellects. But it is not like that. Instead, there is another world of being, alive and sensible by essence, unlike this physical world, a world that is perceived by these true inner senses, not by these transient external ones. That world is divided into a sensible garden or paradise, Jannah or Firdaus, containing the felicities of the blessed, including food, drink, marriage, sensual desire, intercourse, and all that could be delight the soul and give pleasure to the eyes. And a sensible hell, containing the punishments of the wretched, including hellfire, torments, serpents, and scorpions. If this world of soul did not exist, which Alexander mentioned would be undeniably true, and that would mean that the sacred laws and divine books were lying when they maintained a resurrection for everybody. The master of philosophers, Abu Ali Avicenna or Ibn Sina, reported what Alexander had maintained and what could be said in the refutation of that view in his treatise of Hujjat Ashara, the 10 arguments, and elsewhere. But he himself seems to have been inclined towards Alexander's view in another work, in his replies to the questions put to him by Abu Hassan al-Amiri. And in general, what is reported of the leader of the Peripatetics, that is Aristotle, according to Alexander, is the belief that imperfect material souls are dissolved after death. Admittedly, according to Themistius's account, they do have survival. But this is difficult to maintain according to the peripatetic principles, since it implies that these souls have a survival even though they cannot retain any vice of the soul that might torment them or any intellective virtue that might give them pleasure. And yet, if they do survive, it is impossible that they be deprived of all ability to act and be acted upon. These people, that is, Themistius and other philosophers who maintain some kind of survival for imperfect soul, said that God's providence is all-encompassing, and therefore these souls must necessarily have some sort of weak, imaginary happiness of the sort that comes from apprehending the first principles of all reasoning, just as the saying that the whole is greater than the part, and similar notion. Therefore, on their view, it is said that the souls of dead infants are between paradise and hell. This is what Avicenna had to say. But I wonder what happens, what happiness could there be in the perception of these elementary notions? As for those ordinary, honest people who did not acquire a desire for the theoretical science, says the peripatetic philosophers, do not tell us anything about their afterlife or about the sayings concerning their return, and that of the other souls of their ranks, since they do not have the rank of ascent to the world of noetic sanctity. One cannot say that such souls return in the bodies of animals because of the impossibility of reincarnation, nor can one claim that they totally disappear because of what we know concerning the impossibility of corruption in things like souls that are not disposed to it by nature. Accordingly, one group of philosophers was driven to the hypothesis that the souls of the pious and of the ascetics become connected after death with a body composed of vapor and smoke in the atmosphere, and that this body serves as a substrate for what they imagine, through which they attain a sort of imagined happiness. And the wretched likewise attain their punishment this way. Still another group disagreed, rejecting this theory of a vaporous body and corrected it by placing that substrate instead in the body of the heavens. The author of Kitab al-Shifat, that is Avicenna, reported this view on the part of a certain learned man and described it as not a rash conjecture. The author, Sohrawardi, in his Talbihat, the Intimations, agreed with this view about the connection of the soul with the body of the spheres in the case of the blessed. But as for the wretched, he said that they lack the power to rise up to the world of the heavens, because the heavenly spheres possess only luminous souls and noble bodies. Rather, he said, the powers of these sinful souls demand that they have corporeal imaginations, which would be incompatible with the lofty state of the souls of the heavenly spheres. So it is not impossible that there may exist beneath the sphere of the moon and above that of the element fire, still another unbroken spherical body, a distinctive species that would be a substrate for the imagined hellfires, biting snakes, stinging scorpions, and bitter drink. But all the sayings of these worthy men are many stages removed from the path of the reality of the true inner knowing and the way of the lights of the Quran. We have shown the many intellectual errors that their theories entail in our book, Ash-Shawahid al-Rububiyyah, the Divine Witnesses. And that was, I will read the section B as well, because then that finishes this section. So the second illumination. Okay, no, we'll leave B for next week because it begins the section. So let's leave it here. These were sections 9, 10, 11, and 11 of the second Ishraq, or the first part of it. And next week we will begin this part B of this. Now I open the floor to you all for any questions, discussions, gripes, whatever you want to talk about. All yours.
Salam Sheikh. Sorry for leaving my mic on. So I have a question. So on the second page of section 10,
Okay.
he says the transmigration of souls is impossible, while the corporeal resurrection in the spiritual body is actually happening. What exactly does he mean by that?
Well, the transmigration of souls means that a particular soul is moving from body to body to body, from one life to the next on a horizontal level, or it is falling from that other world and either then reascending back to it, then falling back to this one and going into other life forms, etc. Mulla Sadra is saying this is nonsense, right? Because each instantiation of a form, of a physical form that comes into this world, has its own unique form in the other side. Because based on the Quranic verse, God, every day God is upon some new task, and that there's an incessant creation and recreation going on at each moment. So if we take the moment and then extend that moment to a life or particular unique lifetime, that particular lifetime, that particular form of that lifetime, the sensible form and its noetic form are unique also. So it isn't the case that there is that specific noetic form or spiritual body or form, whatever, is moving constantly from life to life to life to life, right? That is the transmig. Then the reincarnation gets even more banal, because reincarnation means that the same soul is traversing, coming back again and again and again and again in the same material world, right? In order to attain its perfection. Mulla Sadra is saying this is also nonsense. This doesn't happen by virtue of the uniqueness of each noetic or each spiritual form that comes at each moment. Now, that this doesn't obviate an archetype that a certain individuated form may exhibit certain archetypal traits of that thing, right? But itself is still unique.
Okay, so I understand that the transmigration of souls is impossible. So could you expand a bit more on what this corporeal resurrection and the
Okay.
spiritual body is? Like, what's that?
So what do we mean by corporeal? Now, in this world, there are different forms of corporeality. There's the physical, material corporeality of this world, which is, as we established a couple of weeks ago, is an accident, right? But then there is a numinous corporeality that is occurring on another plane, right? It has a form. It's a spiritual body. It is what Proclus, the term with the Greek term ochema, right? A spiritual body. So this ochema exists in another world. It is the intellecti of the soul in this world right now. At the point of death, then it's like a child coming out of its mother's belly. It is born into the immediate world above this one. Okay, where, as he said, this is a world with forms, numinous forms, but real nevertheless, right? This is the imaginal world, the alam and mithal. That Sohrawardi coined as a term, and that becomes very important both in Mulla Sadra and a lot of his successors, including the Sheikhi. And the nature of this world is where bodies are spiritualized and spirits are corporealized. If you can, I think it was the last session or the session before, if you look at a Salvador Dali painting or similar, this is what it's trying to convey, that kind of reality. And that is the immediate reality that a soul, upon the moment of the exitus, is experiencing, the first stage. Now, those who have developed themselves, who have even beheld that imaginal world in this life, right, can then, at that moment of exodus, continue their journey even beyond that world. So that is the corporeality that he's talking about. It's talking about a numinous corporeality. There are two forms of corporeality: the physical, spatio-temporal corporeality and the spiritual corporeality of the alam mithal, or the world of the malakut, the angelic world, the world immediately above ours.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, Sadie, if we can continue from this point, the problem with the Aristotle, Avicenna, and so on, this type of philosopher, what I get, because they do not affirm alimul mithal. And there lies the problem what happens with the soul that are not so developed, which tries them, some of them, to say that the souls will disintegrate after their death. But by affirming this alamul mithal, it solves the problem.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Aristotle himself doesn't really have much to say about the post-mortem state. It's actually many of his successors with from Alexander of Aphrodisias all the way, to a few generations before Neoplatonists, where these kind of speculation about the post-mortem reality of a given soul becomes a very center stage debate amongst the pagan peripatetics specifically. It was the Neoplatonists who started to solve this problem, right? So with the Aristotelian, the classic Aristotelian position or peripatetic of Aristotle's successor, there are two kinds of states. There's the state of the commonality of human beings. Then there is the state of, the wise. And the wise, by virtue of their intellection during a whole life and that they have reached the apogee of wisdom, have a sort of, post-existence. But the common masses, because they're dumb or stupid, or, that's it. So once the Platonists come, and especially, I would say, not even so much Proclus, but beginning, I would say, with figures like Porphyry and then Iamblichus especially, we start to get a very developed, a systematically developed conception of the afterlife. And they also, what they do, which is very interesting to me, is that because they considered the Corpus Hermeticum to be their scripture, they extracted all kinds of interesting arguments from the Corpus Hermeticum about the nature of the postmortem state of everybody, but especially the enlightened, which meant their own school. But with
Okay,
this concept of the alam mithal, the imaginal world, it solves several different things simultaneously, right? So it accepts, on the one hand, this noetic paradigm that someone like Mulla Sadra or even the Neoplatonists are talking about, but simultaneously it also has a place to accept these literalist imageries that we get in scripture of, fire and brimstone and burning and all that kind of stuff, by placing it on a different plane altogether rather than taking it literally. And in this, then there are corporealities that are posited, but there is a material corporeality, and then there is a spiritual corporeality.
uh, what would that imply, for example, what happens with the souls of animals and other living beings?
Well, with these guys, it's a little bit difficult because most of them, because of their, a kind of, I would say, peripatetic bias that even to some degree inhabits Neoplatonism, they don't believe that the animals have human souls. Okay, this is where I diverge fundamentally from Neoplatonism itself, because I think their definition of rationality is quite, small. And if we go into, the shamanic traditions, they have a very different notion of rationality and reason, notre, where animals themselves inhabit, they have souls just like humans, and sometimes on the same level, even beyond, especially when we're talking about totem animals. So according to this school, animals are just, these organic robots that once they die, they die. That's it.
That is such an unsatisfying view.
I tell
That
you,
that is a problem I routinely have with these kinds of writings, even when I appreciate them.
that's why I don't agree with it. I subscribe to the more shamanic view of this. That
Yeah,
animals, you know, there's something they have their own nutq and they are natek in their own right. Yeah,
right.
yeah,
I think if I had to venture a criticism here, which would be applicable to what we're reading, but more broadly to the Abrahamic traditions, is we have a anthropomorphic bias,
yes,
and maybe to some extent that's understandable. I mean, it's very hard for a human being to get out of that human experience. But I have to look at these animal typologies, whether positive animals, quote unquote, or negative animals, as ultimately theriomorphizing our own human qualities. It's not
yeah.
really about the beasts, like whether a pig is dirty or not.
This is what surprises me about some of the Neoplatonists, not so much Plotinus and Iamblichus, but Porphyry and especially all the ones that come after them, is that, you know, the Corpus Hermeticum, which they took as scripture, and just, um, they're looking at Hermeticism as the original philosophy, all comes from ancient Egyptian mythos. And the Egyptians had a very sophisticated conception of the animals, that the animals were sort of avatars of the gods, right? So from that ancient pagan perspective, this issue was resolved. So that this whole Platonic Aristotelian notion and Abrahamic one that where animals don't have souls and they're just organic robots doesn't even occur to these ancient people. And this was the matrix from which Neoplatonism itself draws on, whether in its Hermetica or in its own philosophizing. Yet they subscribe to this very narrow-minded conception of the souls of animals, which I find very strange.
Yeah, it is. As you said, given the Egyptian roots of a lot of this wisdom, and even the Greeks themselves, it's strange because I don't think the Greek indigenous religion has such a negative view of animals as the philosophical tradition came to have.
Yeah. It's something I wonder if anybody's explored this because it's something I've always thought about. Very, it's like this is counterintuitive to me. You know, maybe none of these philosophers had pets. So
Yeah, absolutely. And then we get to the absurdity of Descartes practicing vivisection on live animals and thinking it's just like robots. Yet he was so affected by his own child daughter's death. Like, how could he not make the leap of empathy? I don't understand.
God, well,
So I wonder, would you say that animals are subject to the transubstantial motion that human souls are
100,
subject to?
100%.
That is pretty amazing, and you guys are actually surprising me even talking about it because yeah, like I've had pets, I've had cats, and I have to tell you, as much as I love cats and as fascinating as they are, I know they hold a high place in Egyptian mythology, but I have a hard time going there. Like, I don't see much more than an eating machine who just wants to treat you like it's feeding slave and petting slave, and it's kind of stuck in that mode of being where I don't see any transubstantial motion
But
myself. But
there
anyway,
are,
that's
I
me.
mean, I've encountered animals that are so smart that what is hampering them, what impedes them is the material form that encases them, their animal form. But on the level of their mind, these animals can just as well be human for a very simple reason. They understand language, right? So, organic robots are not supposed to understand language, commands, and that sort of thing. So the only explanation is just that, just as with humans, same with animals, you have different levels of intelligence. Some animals, particular animals, are smarter than other in the same species of animals,
That's
right?
true.
I mean, I have, we had a neighbor here who had a dog. This dog was, I swear, was a human being. He would understand, and just the expressions of this dog when it was communicating with you and the emotion that this dog would project at you in your conversation with it was mind-boggling, you know. And
Yeah.
there's many different examples of this. So, either these animals are getting smarter than human beings or they've always been this way. And just as with human beings, we have different levels of intelligence and, emotional intelligence, intellective intelligence. The same occurs with them, which is what many indigenous people already believe,
Right.
Sidi, I wonder if Mulla Sadra by this ayah is not hiding exactly about this reality that the transubstantial motion of animals and that it would be possible for them also to acquire this higher state. وما من دابة في الأرض ولا طائر يطير بجناحيه إلا
Yeah,
أمثالكم. That
yeah,
there is no beast on the earth or birds which flies in the heaven, except they are let's say, the same nations or societies like you are, the
yeah.
person that potentially would hide to the.
Whoops. That's on your microphone cut off.
Yes, I'm here. How you would interpret this?
I agree. I mean, I think the Quran itself, like you just quoted, it itself allows for that. Um, but see, then my question is, then why bring this example up in these chapters when you're talking about lower life forms, when you're exampling the animals? Because then are you just making an arbitrary example, or does what you have been saying up to this point about transubstantial motion also apply to them? That is the question. Now, the argument in itself does apply to all forms of life, not just animals, also to the mineral, vegetative, et cetera, on so on. So by the premise and the axiom of the argument itself, yes, transubstantial motion absolutely applies to animals. And these animals that we find oftentimes that are extremely intelligent, that argument can be made that that's transubstantial motion has occurred in them. That they themselves, in that intellective reality of their animality, have pushed themselves or been pushed in their potentiality to attain a certain actuality that puts their intelligence above their, the common species of themselves.
The next thing which I wonder that if we accept as let's say the general Sufi and Islamic tradition finds that everything has its intellect. Yeah, one of the ayats of Surah Isra, I don't remember it exactly, but everything in the seven heavens and the earth glorifies your Lord Allah,
Yes.
even if you do not understand its language. But every what the division between, let's say, unanimate matter and animate matter, which is life and which is not life, it is arbitrary division that everything has its life and its intellect without
Yes.
exception.
Yeah.
If we accept this point of view, then what is the spatial thing about us humans which makes us to think that we are
Nothing.
the
Well, only
height of
probably
the evolution and hierarchy?
only probably in the potential rather than the actualization, other than those very few humans that he actually mentions at the beginning of that first section that we read, those very few who do actually make it, right? Who actually, or in the way that the Sheikhi school puts it, they do actually accomplish the building of the resurrection body. right? In its fourfold sense. Okay. But you take a human being and the decomposition of its own body and every particular part. Every particular decomposed part has an organism attached to it. So all of those various organisms that are attached to that human body, every element of it, are alive. So then the question is, what has died? Other than a particular intelligible form of that human. So the individuation of a particular archetype that has lived a certain life, that is expired. But everything else about this human in their body has a life form attached to it, and it's living. Even in the postmortem state of that person. Never mind their spiritual resurrection or cellular resurrection.
I was just going to say, I have heard, I can't remember where I read it, but I read somewhere a long time ago that somebody has the view that animals, getting back to animals, actually are higher than humans. So speaking of the special status of human beings, it might even be possible that humans aren't even as close to God as the animals. Like the animals are closer to God.
That is a valid question that you can even extract from the arguments that the Quran itself puts. If everything is praising its Lord, and by implication, everything other than humans is aware of God at all times, it is the human being that is the one that needs to be reminded of that, then by definition, that means that they are more proximate to God than human beings. And if that is the case, then the argument is that they're a higher life form than human beings. So then why place them at a lower level than ourselves?
Exactly. Like we human beings suffer from this condition we call ignorance, but we can't really say that about the animals and other life forms, or at least not that we know of. Very interesting. I never had a dog, but
I've debated this with many traditional theologians, and they can't give me a solid answer to this, whether we're talking about Christians or Muslims. I mean, in the Quran, it's very specific. All things praise their Lord, right? But it is only humans that are repeatedly identified as being forgetful. Now, by implication, what is not forgetful means that they're closer to that principle. And if they're closer to that principle, that means that they're superior to the one that forgets, right?
Even if I remember correctly, that was one of the arguments in Fususul Hikam, which was counterintuitive, but the simpler the existence is, more direct is its connection to God.
Well, that is the chapter of Elias, right? If you remember, where he says, Ibn Arabi says that Elias, in order to attain his perfection, to ascend, to make that final ascension to his Lord, he had to first descend from his humanity, right? And descend as a form of ascension to an animality. And it's from that point where he then ascended properly as a complete spiritual substance to God. So what does that say? That means that in his Bashariya, right, he was still incomplete. That until he came to his Haywaniya, his animality, he couldn't make that final leap. This is Ibn Arabi talking now.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, you've definitely changed my mind on this. I wasn't even thinking of it, but now it's very, very interesting point of view there.
So Ibn Arabi, I think with Ibn Arabi, this matter is a bit settled, and he, even in his Futwat al-Makkiyah, he doesn't share this kind of, arbitrary bias, that the animals are a lower life form and all of that. I mean, he's citing these hadith that most of the hadith people consider to be dubious, where Ali and the Prophet are walking outside of Mecca and the rocks and the trees are greeting them. Most He considers this authentic on the basis that he has experienced this himself.
Wow. And obviously there's good reason why in various cultures, especially the ancient Egyptian, that the animals should occupy, the rank. They're practically gods, they are gods in that mythology. So I'm
Look,
sure there's
I have made this argument to strict monotheists, right? And I'm still waiting for a satisfactory answer from these people. If we take the issue of one and many away from the discussion of religion, right? And look at polytheism as a purely phenomenal, from a purely phenomenological thing. Why is it that every single culture in the world, every so-called pagan culture in the world, has always apotheosized animals? Why? Give me a reason for this, a proper reason for this. The only reason I have for this is because the interaction of humans before the Abrahamic traditions with these animals was spiritual, right? And people who have bonded with animals understand what this experience is. That kind of bonding between a human and an animal is truly a spiritual thing, right? So it is natural that in these various pagan cultures that we have, they would depict their deities or the forces of nature or the cosmic forces or whatever as animals based on that relationship. And if this is the case, if this is the true phenomenology of quote unquote paganism, a term, by the way, that the late Algirdas Davinis had a real problem with. And if this is the case, then we need to completely reappraise everything that we understand by this concept of paganism. Is it even idolatry in that sense? Maybe it's something else.
There's one definition of paganism that it's worship of a particular place on the planet. So is that something to do then with maybe ley lines or
without getting that that conspirological, I look at idolatry as a veil. Anything that becomes a veil is an idol, but whatever liberates, even if it be an effigy, is not an idol. That's my grammar, my esoteric grammar. But in its traditional, conventional literalist definition of what an idol is, it's just that's what it means, an idol. So anything that you worship, that you project divinity or spirit unto, that by definition is an idol. This became such a problem in the later centuries of Islam, especially with the Sufis, that you had someone like Mahmoud Shabestari singing these eternal words in his Rose Garden of Mystery, where he says, گر مسلمان بدانستی که مسلمانی چیست یقین کردی که مسلمانی بت پرستی. If the Muslim only knew what idolatry was, he would testify in truth that Islam is idol worship. Right? So, to kind of disabuse people of this whole, straitjacketed view of idolatry and paganism, because, in this ontology, everything is God, so, or if not literally God, then everything is projecting that presence out of itself by virtue of existing, because the being is primary. So, but, by the same token, anything that becomes a veil, anything that veils from the reality, capital R, and the self, that is the idol.
Like I get the notion that Protestantism and Orthodox Islam are quite similar in their castigation of any figurative art or sign, and yet they worship the printed page.
There you go. Well, not even that. They worship and pray in the direction of a cube, physically and geographically located. I mean, it doesn't get any more pagan than that, does it?
So another question: when the human soul or the body passes on, and there has been some measure of being able to respond to an intentional life, where does the growth in the afterlife in is that in the barzakh, or is that in towards the malakut, or
Well,
where?
the barzakh between this world and the other world is already located in the, as it were, in the borderlands between Nasut and Malakut, right? So that progress occurs. So let's say if a certain soul is stunted in this life, spiritually, we don't mean physically stunted, but spiritually stunted in this life, then obviously they have the opportunity to make up for that lack of growth in the physical world on the other side. What that means depends on the rules of the other side. But yeah, of course, that opportunity is available to everything. Doesn't make any sense otherwise.
So do you think the Quran then does seem to emphasize the burning off of the dross in some kind of
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And this, which is what basically what Ibn Arabi says. You know, his entire post-mortem eschatology is just revolves around this whole question.
because you can get the impression from some Quranic symbols or images that essentially the believers or whatever come into a paradisical state kind of completely, although there are ranks within them. So do you think it's as specifically divided like that, or there's all manner of kind of transitions?
I think there's all manners of transitions. In the Bayani cosmology of all of this, there's a sub-realm within Malakut itself that is introduced, and I've been using this term quite a bit in my own writings over the last 10 years, and it's called the realm of Azamut. And Azamut is a sub-realm of Malakut, of the angelic world. And in this world is where you get the basic division between paradise and hell occur. One on the right side, the other one on the left side. Since it is occurring in that world of Malakut as this kind of a sub-realm of it, right? That means that, at least the way that I interpret this is that a stunted soul that occurs in one of the, or the other, because you can also occur in a paradisal state and be spiritually stunted as well, because that's only a way station. You know, there's still infinite other realms to ascend to, you know, to the final, you know, absorption with the Godhead. That when certain dialectical tensions within the soul are resolved at any level, then it makes an ascension to the next one. Just like on the spiritual path, that whenever there are certain paradoxes or contradictions that weigh you down, and the minute that you resolve them, when you have that aha moment, you make the ascent to the next level of understanding. That in that other realm, it's likewise the same way. But there it has a real ontological, you know, so you're really making an ontological leap at each of these aha moments.
Do you think evolution's a good term for that process, or do you think it's too connected with biological evolution?
Well, as long as we don't, you know, strictly adhere to a Darwinian scheme of what that means, yeah, it's a fine word. Or you can use a Whiteheadian term, you know, kind of a process ontology, you know. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
So I have a question about the
Go for it.
text where he says, according to the habits and states of character which predominate in a man's soul, so will he rise up in a corresponding form on the day of rising, and thus man will become many species in the hereafter, as the divine book expressed it, etc. So this evokes in my mind actually some of the Eastern Christian beliefs about how the condition of a human soul will affect their afterlife experiences. Do the experiences of reward and punishment, am I to infer that this is actually happening because of the disposition of the soul and what it has generated for itself in the barzakh?
Yeah,
Or
yeah, and it's basically a Sufi understanding of that. I mean, Rumi has a lot to say about this in his Masnavi, where he, at one point literally blurts out saying that you're literally creating your postmortem state at this very moment. What you're experiencing now is what your postmortem is going to be like.
ah,
Yeah. So then this is why then the spiritual path becomes this much more important for that very reason, because rather than projecting it into a spatial temporal future of your own life, it brings it to a more imminent kind of thing, so that at any moment, if you expire your last, that last thought or that last whatever it is in you will become the substrate of that paradise or hell that you walk into, that you have built yourself during
I
this.
see. And
Yeah.
that's very different than just a more simplistic understanding of Allah judges you and then sends you hither or thither.
Well, just remember this though. Each being, this is from Ibn Arabi's ontology, which is present here in what he's saying. Each thing has its own Lord, right? So
Right.
at that point of the exodus, it is your own Lord that is judging you.
Ah,
Right?
interesting.
And I heard somewhere that he's saying that's the reason the Mu'tazilis would have a quite big problem because they would be judged according their own rationality.
Yeah. Yeah, the Mu'tazilis will have a real rude awakening on their death.
The joke's on them.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, your Lord is judging you, which is yourself, at your death, which is very Zoroastrian. The meeting with the Diana at the beginning of the postmortem state, who, if you have elevated towards your life with good thoughts and good deeds into a beautiful damsel, will guide you across the bridge of the Sinbad into the halls of light of Ormazd, or if it has become a demon, you will fall off. It will lead you, and you will fall off the bridge of Sinbad into the netherworld of Ahriman.
Right. That's also a very interesting connection here, and that would seem to go back to, I might be wrong, but it might go back to the Quran itself, not just later Persian influences.
Yeah. Which actually does have the kind of a slight notion of the Diana is echoed in several different places of the Quran. One is when it talks about the Qareen, that everyone has had a Qareen, to
Right.
point to them, who will either guide them or mislead them. This is in the Quran. Yeah. Yeah.
So going back to the transubstantial motion, do you think like the concept of fitra, the basic human nature, and as we learned in these principles, there are at least two fitras, and I wonder, are they subject to change, or do you think that they're fundamentally fixed? That's something I struggle with because it's almost a condemnation if they're fixed, and it's much more hopeful to think that one's, or maybe I'm misunderstanding the concept of
No,
fitra.
there's an issue here. On the one hand, what Mulla Sadra seems to be implying is that the fitra is a sort of a absolute potentiality of each individuation, right? To which it should aspire to return and then go up by returning. On the other hand, once we posit this notion of the fitra, does that mean that each fitra has a set potentiality beyond which it cannot go? And that also seems to be implied in both what he's saying and what others are saying. This issue is not completely resolved, other than the fact that, particularly with Ibn Arabi, the fitra is not just pure potentiality. So he doesn't apply any of these categories, these philosophical categories of pure actuality or pure, potentiality, any of that to the fitra at all. His implication is that this is the divine spark itself. And so we can then extract from that, from what Ibn Arabi is implying, is that by virtue of being that divine spark itself, it has the potential to go anywhere. But that going anywhere is completely up to the individual in whether they realize it or not. Whereas with Mulla Sadra and most of these guys, there is an implication that each fetra is kind of set in its in its own dimension and although he doesn't quite put it in those terms himself.
Yeah. Okay. The answer is probably somewhere in between the two. I forget how you say it. The matter lies between the two.
Sure. And yeah.
Probably. Okay. Thank you.
Sure thing. Okay. If nobody has anything further to say, we'll start on part B of this second Ishraq as of tomorrow, as of next week, sorry. And this also starts to get very interesting because he really gets into this issue of the spiritual body and the spiritual corporeality and the material corporeality, what the difference between all of these are. If any of you have access to your copy of Henry Corbin's Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth, this next section of the second mashriq is going to come in handy because there's a lot of that in the second part of the second part. So we'll leave it here for this week and come back again same time next week. Everybody have a good week until next week. Ya Allah.